The brain has 4 lobes: frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital. Let's start examining the gyri of each lobe by first crossing off the ones that are easiest to remember. At the boundary between the frontal and parietal lobes is the central sulcus. The gyrus on the frontal lobe side of this sulcus is the precentral gyrus, while the gyrus on the parietal lobe side is the postcentral gyrus. Next, the frontal and temporal lobes each have a set of 3 gyri: superior, middle, and inferior. Superior frontal gyrus, middle frontal gyrus, inferior frontal gyrus. Superior temporal gyrus, middle temporal gyrus, inferior temporal gyrus. The occipital lobe is a similar situation, with the superior occipital gyrus, lateral occipital gyrus, and inferior occipital gyrus. Now, let's get to the gyri that are harder to remember. Here you see the orbital gyri near the eye socket. The inferior frontal gyrus can be split into 3 sections: the pars orbitalis, closest to your eye socket, or orbit, the pars triangularis, which resembles a triangle, and the pars opercularis, which who knows why they called it that. Finally, let's look at the gyri of the parietal lobe. There are the superior and inferior parietal lobules. The inferior parietal lobule is split into the angular gyrus and the supramarginal gyrus. Now, let's move on to the medial surface. The gyrus hugging the corpus callosum is the cingulate gyrus. This is the gyrus rectus, or straight gyrus. You'll see why it's called that when we examine the brain from the bottom view. This is the superior frontal gyrus. Next, we see the paracentral lobule, so called because within it runs the central sulcus. Then, we have the cuneus and precuneus. These two are separated by the parieto-occipital fissure. There is another important fissure called the calcarine fissure. The cuneus lies on its superior bank, and on its lower bank lies the lingual gyrus, so called because it resembles the shape of the tongue. Moving on, we see the parahippocampal gyrus, at the extremity of which lies the uncus. Then, there's the fusiform gyrus, also called the occipitotemporal gyrus, which you use to recognize faces. And then, we see the inferior and middle temporal gyri peeking out. Let's look at the brain from the bottom now, and I'll keep the medial surface visible next to it so you can see where the gyri continue. First, there's the straight gyrus, and now you can see why it's called that. At the anterior end of the brain, we see the superior frontal gyrus. Immediately posterior to it are the orbital gyri, bounded laterally by the inferior frontal gyrus. Next, let's look at the gyri of the temporal lobe. There is the middle temporal gyrus, inferior temporal gyrus. We also see the fusiform gyrus and the parahippocampal gyrus. Moving on to the occipital lobe, we see the lingual gyrus and the inferior occipital gyrus. We can also see the cingulate gyrus and the cuneus peeking out. Last view of the brain. Let's look inside the sylvian fissure, otherwise called the lateral fissure. We see Heschel's gyri, or Heschel's convolutions, otherwise called the superior transverse temporal gyri. To better illustrate, here is a coronal cross-section of the brain, highlighting the same area. Now, along the top, we see the parietal operculum, the frontal operculum, and the orbital operculum. The inner surface belongs to a structure called the insula, and there are the long gyri of the insula and the short gyri of the insula.